So the Nvidia RTX 3080, everybody has been crazy to get one the last few months, but today I'm going to tell you some of the top things you may not know about this GPU, and maybe it's going to change your mind. Let's get started. Hey guys, Tiago here with Classical Technology. Every time you smash that like button and subscribe, some say the RTX 3080 appears magically right on top of your computer. Alright, so let's get to the topic of today's video, the RTX 3080. We all know how good it is, how good the price to performance is, but today I'm going to tell you a couple of things that you may not actually know about this GPU, and perhaps it may change your mind. The first and one of the biggest ones, the thermals of this GPU. Now, it definitely is not like the 3090, but it's still a pretty hot running GPU, especially if you're talking about the Founders Edition. These GPUs pull a lot more power, such as 300 watts plus, compared to the previous generation 2080 Ti, which was usually under 250 watts. This is going to mean that you're just going to have to run fans, and if you're doing water cooling, you're going to have to run everything a little bit extra in order to keep it cool. One of the biggest problems that a lot of people have encountered, and this actually was worse on the 3090 because the GDDRx VRAM is on the back, so that gives you more problems, but the 3080 also has this issue. Because the RTX 3080 uses GDDR6X VRAM, which is going to be the more powerful, faster type of VRAM as opposed to the one without the X that you may find in like a 3070, it does run a lot hotter than normal. Usually, if you're playing a typical game, you may not really notice the difference, but some people were surprised to find their fans, especially in the Founders Edition, going up really high, and they looked at their GPU core temperatures and it seemed okay, like in the 60s and 70s. Eventually, when HWinfo64 came out with a reading of the VRAM temperatures, people saw that the VRAM was actually thermal throttling. The T-junction temperature limit is around 110 degrees Celsius, but as it starts to climb up there, 105, 106, you're going to start to notice degraded performance. Now, where could you notice this happening? Well, a couple of places. Usually, normal games may not trigger it, but if you're doing something that uses up a lot of VRAM, something like maybe Flight Sim 2020 or something like, Cyberpunk 2077 that has a lot of ray tracing. And if you're doing content creation, like let's say if you're rendering out with these GPUs, that a lot of people use them to render in something like DaVinci Resolve. If you're doing like 6K or even 8K footage that really eats up that VRAM, you're going to see your GPU fans throttle considerably more than if you were just playing a regular game or something like that. And of course, the big one is going to be mining. That's how a lot of people actually figured out that their VRAM is throttling, because if their GPU was supposed to get a certain mega hash, like 96 or something like that for the RTX 3080, they would see it drop down to 80 to 70 to 60, depending how badly it was thermal throttling. And a lot of people would look at the GPU core, like I said, seem normal. So that's a major thing you have to know about the RTX 3080. Now, the Founders Edition cooler, while it's an awesome design, it really had this problem a lot more than the other versions of the GPU that I saw. For example, like an EVGA for the Win 3, the VRAM may run a little bit hotter than normal, but it's not as likely to thermal throttle as something like the Founders Edition. So what type of fix did people find? Well, water cooling often will bring these temperatures down more closer to 90 or in the 80 C range, which is definitely going to be more normal even during like intense VRAM applications. And of course, a lot of people even took apart their GPU, switched out the thermal pads, and put them back on and saw a pretty significant drop in temperatures. So that's why I mentioned this first. This is one of the biggest things you have to know about the RTX 3080. Yes, the GPU core, most of them work fine, but you do have the caveat of it having this GDDR6X RAM running really hot. Not to mention that it does draw a lot of power, so in many cases it's going to run hot anyway if you don't have the proper airflow. So what's something else you may not know or really not think about the RTX 3080 that should be important? Well, it only has 10 gigabytes of this hot running VRAM. Now, for most games and applications, 10 gigabytes of VRAM is perfectly fine, but that shows you why the 3080 Ti came out with 12 gigabytes of VRAM and the 3090 has a whopping 24 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, not all games will take advantage of even 10, But it is possible, especially during the next year, the next 2 years, that we will start to view that as a bottleneck in some cases. There have even been something showing that some of the AMD GPUs with 16 gigabytes of VRAM are beating things like the 3070 and even the 3080 in games that do need a lot more VRAM. A lot of times this will be stuff like, Flight Sim 2020, things that really are intense 4K. And even if you play 8K gaming, you better have something like an RTX 3090 because that's certainly going to take advantage of it. And while that's not here now in the mainstream, eventually during the next few years, it certainly will be. So that's definitely a point you should consider about the RTX 3080. That's not really all that positive. 10 gigabytes of VRAM, mostly enough. But aside from it getting really hot, there will be certain use cases that you're going to run up against that limit, and another GPU with more VRAM will outperform it. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. If you want a 3080, take a look at the game that you want to play. Make sure if it's in 4K or something like that. There are a lot of user experiences online for particular games. If it looks like 10 gigabytes of VRAM is going to be a problem, you may have to step up to the 3080 Ti, or if you want to be really intense, you may just need a 3090, for example, like content creators, or some people really pushing the limits with VR and things of that nature. So that's something to keep in mind. 10 gigabytes of VRAM is, enough for most people, most resolutions, but you can certainly come up against certain use cases that you're going to have a problem. So if you're more of an extreme user, just remember to keep an eye on that VRAM. And something else that you should know about the RTX 3080, it seems to be one of the most difficult GPUs to find. So 2020 proved to be incredibly difficult to get new hardware, specifically GPUs. I'm going to tell you that 2021 may not really be all that much better. We're going to see, is it going to get any better if you're looking for a GPU? Let's say you walk into a store or you go on Newegg or Amazon. With the RX 6000 series GPUs, AMD has put out a pretty quality and compelling product. The major issue here is going to be how they handled the launch not only of last week's reference GPUs, but even worse, the third-party AIB partners, which were supposed to launch today. You won't believe how much stock we actually got. Now, I know what you're saying. Everything's been sold out and out of stock, but particularly so, the RTX 3080 has been more difficult to get your hands on. You could find 3090s a lot easier. Yes, they're more expensive, and that's part of the reason. You can find 3070s, 3070 Ti. Pretty much all of the other GPUs are much easier to find during the last several months, including now. But the RTX 3080 certainly seems like it's one of the most difficult to find. Perhaps that's due to its price to performance. Initially at $699, it really performed very well for that price. And of course, we saw the prices skyrocket to pretty much triple that, over $2,000 at the peak in May. Now they're coming down a little bit closer to reality, maybe around $1,500 to $1,400, which is closer to reality, but still very far. Don't get me wrong. We want to see these at MSRP, which is from $699 to maybe like $900 to $1,000, something like that, with some of the third-party AIB partners. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm sure if you've searched for a 3080, you've seen that specifically the 3080 is more difficult to find than the 3090, than 3070s, than even some of the AMD GPUs. That's something that it's just due to how the GPU is. Maybe Nvidia didn't want to sell as many of those to push like a 3080 Ti or something like that. So that's definitely something to consider. Now, another fact that you should know about the 3080, this is going to be with Nvidia's new changes with LHR. That's going to be the lite hash rate. Basically just means that the hash rate, if you're going to use it for mining, is going to be half of its capacity, sort of where it was before. Now, most of them that were sold, up until this point or to several months ago, they're all going to be full-fledged without any limits. The ones going forward have a high chance of being LHR and just not being as good for mining as the other GPUs. Even EVGA switched a lot of people that were on queue for the older version to this newer version, giving them a warning if they want to stay on or not. So that's something to consider, even if you're not going to be using the GPU for mining, because the LHR models potentially could affect the price. You could say that they weren't mined on and maybe they're a little more pristine in terms of resale, but if mining continues to be good and if it goes up in the future, you're going to have less people to actually sell that GPU to in the market because they're not going to be as interested in case you need to sell it to upgrade or something like that. The RTX 3090 doesn't have that limitation, but just keep in mind the RTX 3080 does, and that may have some effect on it for sure. Alright guys, so these were some things you may not know about the RTX 3080. Let me know if there's anything else that surprised you about this particular GPU. I may do this also with other GPUs and kind of pick out things that I've learned over time. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.